So last time we took a look at how to solve quadratic equations when the quadratic equation factored nicely. And you can see that x squared minus 3x plus 2 factors nicely as x minus 2 times x minus 1. That turns one complicated equation into two simple equations, because when the product of two things gives you 0, one of them has to be 0. And so this one is relatively easy to solve. But what happens when you have a quadratic equation which doesn't factor nicely? Well, at that point, you usually fall back on the quadratic formula. So to solve a quadratic equation, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, the quadratic equation says that x gives you, there are really two answers for x, and you get one of them by taking this plus this quantity underneath the square root sign over 2a, and then this minus that quantity. So let's try it with this quadratic equation, which does not factor particularly nicely. So in this case, the a, the number in front of the x is just a 1, the b is -3, and the c is 1. Those are the numbers in front of the x squared, the x, and the constant term, respectively. So let's just go ahead and plug that all in over here. So x is going to equal negative b, so -3 plus or minus the square root of -3 squared again, b squared minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is 1, all over 2 times 1. And so that gives us -3, which is just 3, plus or minus the square root of -3 squared is +9, minus 4 times 1 times 1 is -4, all over 2. We can simplify that just a little bit more by taking 9 minus 4 to get 5. So 3 plus or minus the square root of 5 all over 2. I want to point out that that's really two numbers on the number line. That's 3 plus the square root of 5 divided by 2. And it's also 3 minus the square root of 5 divided by 2. And of course, if you prefer decimal numbers, you can turn them into decimals at that point. So when a quadratic equation factors nicely, that's probably the easiest way to do it. When a quadratic equation doesn't factor particularly nicely, then we generally fall back on the quadratic formula. The other thing I want to take a look at in this lecture is what to do when we have a cubic equation, a third-degree equation, with at least one special property. So let's take a look at this equation right here. How about we have x to the power 3 minus, let's say, 4x squared plus 3x equals 0. And now notice there's no constant term here. I could have had a number times x cubed plus or minus a number times x squared plus or minus number times x plus or minus just some number by itself, but I don't have that right here. What that means is each term, and there are 3 terms here, has an x in it. And so the simplest kind of factoring, the first one you always look to, is common factor. And every term has the same thing in it. You can pull that out. So we have an x here, an x here, an x here. I can pull that out. So once I pull this x out, what do I multiply x by to get x cubed? I multiply it by x squared. So x times x squared is x cubed. That takes care of this first term. Let's pull the x out of the 4x squared. What do I multiply x by to get 4x squared? Well, I multiply it by 4x. X times 4x is 4x squared. And what do I multiply x by to get 3x? Well, I just multiply it by the number 3, of course. So you can check that if you multiply this x back into every term, you get back what you started with. Now, let's take that principle that we learned last time, that when you have two things that multiply to give you 0, one of them has to be 0. And let's write this still complicated looking expression as two simpler looking expressions. So x, this first part equals 0. So if this times this equals 0, either the first part equals 0 or the second part equals 0. X squared minus 4x plus 3 equals 0. Now that still looks kind of complicated, but that looks an awful lot better than what we started with because it's just a quadratic, and we're used to solving quadratics by now. So either this factors nicely, or if it doesn't factor nicely, we can use the quadratic formula on it, but this one happens to factor nicely. I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to give you positive 3 and add to give you negative 4. And so the two numbers that multiply to give you positive 3 and add to give you negative 4 are negative 3 and negative 1. The order doesn't matter. You could have negative 1 first and negative 3 second. So either this equals 0 or this product equals 0. So since this product equals 0, x minus 3 equals 0, or x minus 1 equals 0. So x equals 3, or x equals 1, or x equals 0. A cubic expression like this with an x to the power 3 can have as many as 3 solutions. And this one does have 3 solutions.